on frictions in housing markets, looked at various market imperfections that affect household housing choices and their impact their financial outcomes. His field of research is housing economics with a focus on international housing policy and finance. His particular interest is on how housing market institutions and market designs affect household access to housing. Prior to completing his PhD, Dr. Acolin was a research associate in the real estate department of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he worked on housing, urbanization, and economic development issues. He obtained a master's in urban policy from the London School of Economics and Sciences, Paris, and an undergraduate degree in urban studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Currently, he is teaching Introduction to Real Estate Economics and Market Analysis and Advanced Real Estate Finance and Investment. So with that, Dr. Acolin, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Sandy, for this introduction. So yes, I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Washington, and I have been in Seattle now for 4 years, and it has been really a pleasure to discover this region. Today, I will share research that I have been conducting over the last couple of years on homeownership and barrier to access to homeownership. But before that, I just wanted to give a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from on that. So I'm originally from France, a country that doesn't really recognize race or ethnicity as categories that are socially constructed categories. And coming to the US, it has been really an important realization how much some of our social life and access to resources are shaped by where we are born, where we come from, but also our race and ethnicity. In the US context, that's one of those categories that has a huge determinant on life outcomes going from health to education, and in our case, housing. And so that's really an important area to pay attention to, particularly for professionals and practitioners who are involved in those transactions on a daily basis. Those categories, race, ethnicity, have been protected now for over half a century. And nonetheless, we are still at a stage where huge discrepancies in both outcome and treatment exist based on who you are. So today I will cover a relatively broad set of questions, but I will mostly focus really on the large and persistent minority white homeownership gap. This gap has been around for a long time, but it has increased following the Great Recession. And in particular for Black households, it's now at a really high level, an historically high level. So out of the fourth quarter of 2020, it's estimated that Black households are 30 percentage points less likely to be homeowners than white households. That means that they have an homeownership rate that is only about 42% compared to about 72% for white households. And there is a lot of reason and factors that explain that gap, but it's really important to understand where it comes from, how it can be addressed, and what needs to be done to address it. Due to the importance of homeownership for household, many of us at least aspire to become homeowners at one point in our life or are already homeowners. And many of you have helped hundreds or thousands of households become homeowners over the course of your career. And so you all know why homeownership matters at the individual level. It also really matters at the social community level for a variety of reasons, including really this ability to build assets, to build wealth. And it has implication on housing markets and their functioning. And so today I will review some of the recent evidence on this homeownership gap, and some of the work that has been done by others, particularly people at Urban Institute, on identifying some of the potential changes that could improve access for minority households, particularly Black households. So going back in time and going back to over 120 years, we can see that white households have historically had higher level of homeownership than Black households or Hispanic households. You can see that in the early 1900s, homeownership rate for white household was around 50%, and it was only around 20 to 25% for Black household. moving forward after World War II, there was this rapid increase that was mostly driven by policy changes, in addition to changes in the production of housing. But really the GI bills and the availability of cheap mortgages has been shown to be one of the big reasons why we see that huge jump in homeownership between 1940s and the 1960s, when homeownership overall increased from about 45% to about 65% within 20-year period. And that was to a large extent due to some federal involvement in mortgage market, federal backing of FHA, and really availability of cheap credit with low down payment. And so those required public resources, voluntary choices to make that happen. But that really drove homeownership rate to the level that we have experienced over the last 50 years, around 65%, with some small changes over time, but pretty stable, around 2/3 of household owning overall. However, that 65% overall hides some large disparities. And you can see that while the white homeownership rate has been relatively stable around 70% over the last 20, 30 years, for Black household, it hasn't reached 50% in that time period. And that's not just in the US overall. When we bring it to Washington State or Seattle, we can see similar disparities, even somewhat larger in Washington State, where the homeownership overall is a little bit lower than nationwide, but it's a lot lower for Black household. So in Washington State overall, for Black household, less than 1/3 of them are homeowners, compared to 2/3 of white or Asian household. And that discrepancy is really quite staggering when you bring it back to some of the most expensive market where it's harder overall for household to become homeowner. So thinking of Seattle as the exemplary in our state, overall homeownership rate is much lower in Seattle due to the high cost of living, the fact that you have a lot more young households for whom renting is a better option, and the fact that not everybody wants to be a homeowners. But while about half of white household in Seattle own, less than 1/5 of a Black household own, and only 1/4 of Hispanic household. So that's also a staggering gap in this local level as well. And that hasn't changed much over the last 20, 25 years. There was a bit of a tightening during the 2005, 2006 housing boom. That boom was not sustained or sustainable, and so you saw a decrease in homeownership, not only for Black and Hispanic household, but the big difference is that Black household haven't recovered nearly as much as the other group. So by the first quarter of 2020, you can see that the homeownership rate for white household was back to level pretty close to what they were in 2004, 2006 period. But for Black household, they were still about 5 percentage points lower. So the loss in homeownership that happened during the housing crash of the late 2000s was never recovered. That ground was never recovered for Black household, and contributing to really this persistence of the homeownership gap that has even grown in recent years. And there are a lot of reasons for that gap, right? You can think about it as reflecting differences in age structure, in household structure. But even when you look across different ages, you can see that really large difference in homeownership rate. So on the left here, I'm showing the homeownership rate for white household based on age group. And as you would expect, in all cases, younger households are substantially less likely to own, while older household defined in this case as being 65 and over are overwhelmingly owners. And that's the case as well among Black household. So among Black household, if you look at people who are 65 plus, 80% of them overall achieve homeownership, although that has decreased slightly in recent years. But where the largest difference is among those young households. So household in their under 35, first-time homeowners, where Blacks are not able to attain homeownership, in part because they have low access to wealth, low access to parental support. And and it takes a longer time for those households to become homeowners. And so that's where really a lot of the gap is created in that early stage of accessing homeownership. And it's well known that the youngest you're able to access a home, the more you can benefit of price appreciation, the more you can benefit of being able to repay that mortgage over a 20 or 30 year time period. And so delaying that access to homeownership to being in your 40s or 50s means that you have less time to build up wealth and less wealth to pass on to your children. And that's particularly concerning because that has been happening quite broadly in the recovery period post-Great Recession, where first-time home buyers have had a hard time accessing mortgages, have had a hard time becoming homeowners. And there are different measures of the share of first-time homeowners, but the measures that developed by the NAR or that we can develop based on credit, consumer credit panels show that we haven't gone back to the level of first-time home buyers that used to be achieved in the early 2000 period. And so that's concerning because that means that the housing market as it functions right now, despite the low cost of credit, despite really low interest rate, is not able to produce solution for starter home financed for young homeowners who have a stable income, stable job, would be able to qualify for a mortgage, but don't have the down payment, don't have the saving, in part due to high renting costs and lack of access to financial resources. Going back to the homeownership gap, for the Black-white homeownership gap in particular, it has been now over 50 years since the Fair Housing Act was adopted, which really made any form of discrimination based on race or ethnicity illegal in the housing market, and really tried to ensure equal access to mortgage credit. And so that act has been now in place. There has been action to try to make sure that it was implemented properly. Nonetheless, the homeownership rate for Black households remain much lower than for white households. And so that 30 percentage point gap that I mentioned earlier is still there, hasn't really moved much in recent years after the Great Recession, and is as high or higher than it has been since we have data recorded in census surveys. And so, and that gap also remained quite high for Hispanic households, although that's not the focus today, but in the state, that's also an important demographic. And it hasn't really decreased either, in part because of much higher rate of recent immigrants among Hispanic households in recent decades than it was in the 1970s. But the two big factors that have been barriers to access for homeownership have been housing cost burden and credit constraint that are particularly biting for minority households who don't have parental wealth and to build on in order to support young households to get a down payment or to get access to mortgage credit. So in recent work that I did with two co-authors, Susan Wachter and Desan Lin, we try to decompose that gap into the portion of the gap that can be explained by things like education, income, household structure. So those, what we call endowment, or what the literature called endowment, are really the factors that are really important in predicting your likelihood to be a homeowner. So your age will be a big factor in predicting if someone is a homeowner or not. Someone's educational achievement and income also are a big factor that will enable people to be homeowners and also determine whether or not that's a preferred form of tenure for them. And so for that, in our data, we are able to control for income, educational attainment, age, gender, marital status, household size, and location. And those are important. However, we are not able to control for everything. In particular, we don't have direct access to a household parental wealth or to credit score. And so those are important omitted variables that can explain some of the residual, some of the gap that we are not able to explain. But another big portion of that gap is also based on unobserved barrier, such as discriminatory practices and their legacy that are not in our model, that we don't control for directly, and can explain some of that residual gap. So combine the lack of information about parental resources and about unobserved barrier can explain some of that residual. In other work, in particular by a team that was able to work with Freddie Mac on some of the data they have on underwriting, while also having access to parental wealth information, it's shown that parental wealth is a big factor, but that there is still this unobserved residual that is also important. So coming from those structural barriers, structural racism history. So going to the result of that analysis, what we find is that in the 1989 or 2005 period, our endowment measure was able to account for about 2/3 of the homeownership gap. In the later years, post Great Recession in 2013, 2017, only about half of the gap was explained by those endowment characteristics. So again, those endowments are some of the big predictor of homeownership. And so differences in age structure, differences in being married or not, differences in income explain a big share of that gap, but it's only about half. And so the other half mean that even if you had identical income and identical education and identical age among Black and white households, you will still have about half of that 30 percentage point gap present today. And so that will still be a 15 to 20 percentage point gap that will be essentially residual, even if Black households were able to attain the same level of education as white households. When looking at other groups, we find similarly that a substantial portion of the gap is unexplained, although once we account for immigration, particularly for Hispanic and for Asian, once we account for immigration, almost all of the gap become explained. And the big difference relative to Black household is that the explained portion of the gap has been relatively stable or even increasing. And so it's really only among Black household that we see this decrease in the share of the gap that is able to be explained by endowment. And that raises some really difficult policy conversation about what to do about it. I mentioned that other paper done, and I have a slide at the end that points to this paper if some of you are interested, that other paper that really looked at parental wealth and education together. And what the conclusion of that paper is that even if we were able to find effective policies to increase educational outcome among Black households, we will still not be able to close that homeownership gap, and we will still not be able to have parity in homeownership outcome between a Black and white household. And so that's concerning for policy reasons. That's also concerning at the community and individual level. And so when we think about a country like the US that is increasingly diverse, the impact of maintaining that gap is that the aggregate homeownership rate will be about 1 to 2.5 percentage points lower by 2050 if we don't do anything to address that gap. And so some of the work from Urban Institute really tried to get to solution to addressing that gap, because that also has big consequences for wealth and wealth accumulation. There is no other form of saving contract than mortgages, where if you don't make your monthly commitment, you will be evicted from your home. And so that forced saving mechanism associated with mortgage repayment, in addition to the price appreciation that has been experienced by many households who have been able to own their house for 10 or 15 years, is one of the big reasons why home equity is the main component of household wealth, particularly for households in the 80th lowest percentile of income. So middle income household, for them, home equity is really the main asset that they own, the main source of their wealth. And you can see, again, those are just illustrative. You probably have seen a lot of them. That one of the things that the industry has been really good at advertising is that homeowners have much higher wealth than renters. And there are a lot of reasons to that. Again, differences in endowment, differences in age. But even when you account for those differences, homeownership is still one of the best way for low and moderate income households to build wealth over time and to pass that wealth to their household. And so that intergenerational economic mobility that comes from homeownership is extremely important, and not having access to it disproportionately for minority and particularly Black households is depriving a substantial portion of the population from that great way of building wealth. And there are concerns on making sure that when you become a homeowner, you're able to have access to sustainable form of mortgages, sustainable form of credit, that you don't pay more for your credit than your neighbors. And those are really well documented. There are a number of papers that have shown that minority homeowners have worse outcomes than white homeowners, even if you control for their characteristics. And so that overall they face smaller benefit of becoming homeowners. Nonetheless, it still remains for all households, white or Black or other race and ethnicity, one of the main ways through which it's possible to accumulate wealth over time. And so going forward, as I mentioned, if the current trends continue, Urban Institute recently estimated, and I apologize, the quality of this graph is great, but if the current level of achievement of homeownership by age group remain on the current trajectory, by 2040, so 20 years from now, the homeownership overall will be 3 percentage points lower. So instead of being 65%, it will be about 62%. And in addition, when you put it into numbers, that will mean that there will be 3 million fewer households will have become homeowners. That's 3 million homes that would have been sold to individual households that instead will remain in the rental stock or would be provided through apartments instead of representing a transaction and being the first step towards building wealth for those households. And so what to do about it, and particularly in a growing region like the Seattle Metro or Washington State in general that has experienced rapid price appreciation and rapid rent growth until the recent slowdown in the rental market, at least. So in those regions, it can be particularly challenging to support access to homeownership. But there are a series of recommendations that Urban Institute has developed that can really help think about the menu of options. It's not a silver bullet kind of strategy. It's really doing coordinated action from public actors, private actors at the federal and local government level. Nonprofit as well have a role to play in expanding financial options. And so that means working with the for-profit sector, the private sector, in finding new ways of assessing creditworthiness. So credit scores have not really changed over the last 25 years. There have been very limited changes at the margin on what kind of events qualify or how long certain events stay on your credit. But what gets into a credit score, the FICO formula have remained relatively stable for the purpose of underwriting for the GSEs. There has been some innovation on their end to try to incorporate new form of data, but so far regulators have not approved them for the public mortgage government-sponsored enterprise. And so finding alternative data in mortgage underwriting, such as rental payment history or utility payment, that have been shown to be really highly correlated with your ability to repay, your ability to make your mortgage payment. And so finding ways to incorporate them in credit score would potentially open additional households would be eligible for prime credit. In addition, there is a need increasingly to find some flexible products for households with high income volatility. Particularly after the Great Recession, one of the big tightening has been in the type of product that would allow to underwrite a household with independent income, several forms of income, or high volatility in their income over the last 2 years. And there are really good reasons for that, right? You don't want to provide mortgages to households who will not be able to repay it. And if you have had very volatile income over the last 1 or 2 years, that's a good predictor that you will have volatile income over the next 2 or 3 years, and at which point you might have difficulty making your monthly payment. And so those kind of products have been essentially non-existent for the last 10 years now, but there is a need for finding ways to underwrite income from independent activities. So how do you underwrite income from Uber driver? How do you underwrite additional income from someone who has a 9-to-5 job, but in addition does some some consulting work or does some additional work on the side or contracting work. And so there's a need for those kind of financial innovation. There's also a need to build on programs that have been shown to provide sustainable access to homeownership for low and moderate income households, particularly a minority household. In particular, in that regard, I want to highlight the role of shared equity homeownership programs. I don't know if you're all familiar with them. That's mostly community land trust. That might be the most popular one or the better known one, particularly in the region. But those shared equity homeownership essentially find ways to provide some community investment in the land and in the building. And so it could be some limited equity co-op or community land trust, where you have a non-profit organization in general owning the land or owning the ground lease on the property. And the household only purchase a structure, which in rapidly increasing market like the Seattle region, the land appreciation is really the driver of price appreciation. And so if you remove land from the equation, you're able to have much more affordable form of homeownership. In exchange for that, in general, you have some limits on how much equity you're building and what will be the resale formula. So at resale, you might not get the full appreciation. Like if prices increase by 25% during your holding period, you might only get 10 or 15%. So you will not get as much appreciation as the market would, but you will still benefit from the forced saving of repaying your mortgage, and you will still have a pretty steady appreciation. And so those kind of programs have been shown to be really effective in building wealth and to be options for minority borrowers in particular. One of the limits is that you need to have capital to invest originally. And so there need to be some commitment from nonprofit or public institution to purchase the land, to purchase the properties. And that's a big barrier to bring them up to scale. Another area, and that's one where your group and all of you can play and do play a big role, is improving and expanding financial education and homeownership preparation. And some of you probably do that in your daily job when you advise homeowners from any race or ethnicity. But beyond that, there's also a need for some program that specifically target households who are first-time home buyers, haven't had much exposure to the home buying process from their social network, and making sure that they build up their finances, their saving, and are prepared to be homeowners. And that's particularly important for minority communities that have historically had lower homeownership attainment and therefore less experience with what it takes to buy and maintain a home. And finally, and in my mind, something that we really need to think about a lot more at the national level, in national conversation, as well as the local level, is finding ways to provide resources for low, no interest assistance for down payment and closing costs. If we think about the huge expansion in homeownership that took place after World War II, the role of GI Bills and some of the grants that were available for veterans was one of the big factors that allowed people to buy in single family subdivision that were being built all across the nation in the 1950s, 1960s, the Levittown of the world. And that was financed through public fund, financed through public intervention in supporting FHA and providing those low down payment mortgages. Similarly, at a time when we are just still coming out of the recession and still in the pandemic, finding ways to stimulate further home construction and businesses through stable sources of down payment for starter home, first-time home buyer, could have both important economic stimulus effect as well as providing that first step on the ladder toward building wealth and accessing homeownership. And so some of those programs have been increasingly discussed in the last year with some of the social unrest around police brutality and reparation. But beyond the racial ethnic component, having some criteria based on parental wealth as well as household endowment that will make you eligible to receive those assistance programs, whether you're Black, white, Asian, or Hispanic. But if you meet those criteria, you will be accessing those programs, could have particularly strong effect on Black homeownership, since those households are more likely to not receive the parental resources that many of us depend on to become first-time homeowners. From any race or ethnicity, the parental support has been a big factor in sustaining access to homeownership. So I just want to conclude briefly by mentioning that I know that there has been really robust transaction volumes, including in the state, that the main issue tend to be inventory rather than demand at the moment. But we haven't gone back to the level of production that took place in the early 2000s. And that was the 2004-2006 period was to a large extent an exuberant period, a period of excessive risk in the mortgage market, where this product risk really was too high. But going back to the early 2000s or to the 1990s, Urban Institute really makes the case that we are now not seeing anywhere near the level of borrower risk that we are taking in the 1990s or early 2000s, that were considered to be somewhat reasonable lending standards, and that there is a role for finding sustainable way of lifting some of those borrowing constraints. And that will allow more households, particularly households who have decent credit score, so in this kind of 660 to 720 or 720 to 760 categories, that used to be a lot of the mortgages that were originated in the early 2000s, not so much in the mid 2000s, where it was a lot of the subprime, sub 620. But in that period, you had a lot of the volume that were going to those 660 to 760 credit score household. Right now, almost all of it is going to 760 plus. And so finding ways to grow again access to mortgages for those households will contribute to expand the pool of borrowers, to expand access to homeownership, including for minority households. And so in summary, there is this really large and persistent homeownership gap, both in the nation and in Washington state. And addressing it will require coordinated action and will require some investment and some resources from private and public actors. But if we don't do it, we are depriving access to homeownership from people who would be able to benefit from it, from whom it will be the optimal form of tenure. We are limiting the functioning of the market on the resale and new house side. And there are things that can be done to do that. So here I just have a few links. I think that this will be probably available after the talk if you're interested in reading more about it. In particular, Urban Institute has really done a lot of work on reducing the homeownership gap and has really good resources that are available for and provide a lot of information there. I also wanted to mention just briefly for advertisement that at UW, we now have both an undergraduate and a graduate program in real estate. At the undergraduate level, we have a minor and a major. The major was just launched in September, and we have a strong interest from students, including some students who want to go into the brokerage route. We have about 30 students who are in the major right now, about 100 students in the minor. So there's a lot of interest in real estate education at UW. And at the master level, we now have a 1-year and 3-year options. So for people who have a background in business and real estate, they're able to do the 1-year option. For people who want to change career, they have the 2-year options. So if you have any interest or know people in your network interested in real estate education, we now cover from undergrad to graduate. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Your presentation was great and we appreciate your time. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Arthur? If you have a question, you can unmute yourself or put it in chat, but it doesn't look like we have any questions. There is a comment. Can you please share the links to additional articles from the last slide in the chat so we can grab them?
Sure.
Great.
Let me stop sharing.
What is your understanding of, so there's the anti-gentrification movement that's happening, driven by Black-led organizations in Seattle. What is your understanding of the work that's being done there? Or do you have a sense of it?
Yes, so in Seattle in particular, right, in the central district, there has been a lot of pressure on development, and you have had long-time renters or long-time homeowners that have felt that pressure, either through an increase in their property tax or also an increase in rent for the renters. And so I think that some of the movement to find ways to leverage current assets for homeowners, whether they are individual or institution like churches that have real estate, finding ways to better utilize those assets and keep them in the community is important. But the other part has really been some of those community land trusts that have been trying to emerge. It's really hard to set them up and to get the resources, but I think there's a role for that. And I think that because we haven't had some of that sustainable community involvement in development, instead you have had a lot of opposition and a lot of resistance to any form of development, even if probably increasing, I mean, at least in my view, increasing, and that's more personal view, I think, than research, but I will just say, I think that increasing the supply of housing in the central district is probably one of the best use of that land and that location. You're within a stone's throw of downtown and all of the jobs that are there, and you have extremely rich cultural and retail environment that makes that location extremely desirable. And so allowing more households to live there is probably a benefit, but it needs to be done in a way that doesn't push out people and provide option for long-time homeowners to benefit from it, as well as for long-time renters, really.
Would you be open to me reaching out to you? I'm a MPA student right now doing work in this area. So I'd love to, would you be open to that?
Of course.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, and Liz, will there be a way to share the slide, or is that not an option?
Hey Liz, this is Kara. I can post the deck to our diversity, equity, and inclusion page on our website. It's warealtor.org/DEI. I will put the link in the chat.
And I will also just put my contact info here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk or discuss. Yeah.
All right, any other questions before we wrap this up? No? Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Dr. Arthur Acolin, and we'll see you all later. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.